Greetings and welcome to all of you who are joining us via Zoom and YouTube for tonight's event, Reading Muslims Through the Culture Wars, a public lecture by Zareena Grewal. My name is Marie Griffith, and I'm the director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics here at Washington University in St. Louis. And I'm delighted that you've chosen to spend some time with us this evening, which comes auspiciously at the dawn of the holy month of Ramadan. Before I introduce tonight's speaker and her interlocutor, let me note the center's next upcoming event. On April 26th at 6 o'clock Central Time, we will co-host a panel discussion between Professor David Kurtzer and Father John Polakowski titled Reckoning with History, Pope Pius XII and the Holocaust. This event is co-sponsored with the Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis, Catholic Theological Union, and it's based on a screening of the film Holy Silence. Our panelists will discuss the Vatican's reaction to the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany and how the Pope responded to the horrors of the Holocaust. Details on how to view the film will be emailed out to all who register for this event. So please stay tuned for that information and we'll get it out on our email list very soon. And now to our very distinguished speaker this evening. Zareena Grewal is widely known as a prominent scholar, documentary filmmaker, and influential public intellectual who speaks to a broad array of issues that are urgent in both the United States and the world. As a scholar, she is an associate professor of American Studies, Religious Studies, Anthropology, and Ethnicity, Race, and Migration at Yale University. Her first book, Islam is a Foreign Country, American Muslims and the Global Crisis of Authority, is a historical ethnography of transnational Muslim intellectual networks that link US mosques to Islamic movements in post-colonial Middle East, through debates about the reform of Islam. And this project is based on fieldwork that she did in Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. She is currently working on the reform of, on a book titled, Is the Quran a Good Book?, which explores the range of meanings the Quran has for Americans in relation to national debates about religious tolerance, racism, and the culture wars. As a documentary filmmaker, she is best known for her film titled By the Dawn's Early Light, Chris Jackson's Journey to Islam. The film examines Islamophobia before September 11th, 2001, through the story of the NBA player who has been dubbed the Kaepernick of the 90s. It was nationally broadcast on the Documentary Channel and featured on ESPN, and she is at work now on a new film titled Muslim in America. Finally, as a public intellectual, she is highly sought after by both print and electronic media outlets of diverse kinds. Her writing appears in the Washington Post, New York Times, The Atlantic, and many other such mainstream media publications. In covering all of this ground so beautifully and so brilliantly, she is an inspiration to scholars who want their work to make an immediate, concrete difference in the world, and I admire her very much for that. After Professor Graywall presents her lecture, our own Professor Tazeen Ali will engage her in a Q&A period before opening up to questions from the audience. Professor Ali is Assistant Professor of Religion and Politics here at Washington University, based in the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. Professor Ali's research and teaching focus on Islam in America, women's religious authority, and Islam, gender, and race. Her book in progress, Authorizing Women, Islamic Authority at the Women's Mosque of America, analyzes how American Muslim women negotiate the Islamic tradition to cultivate religious authority and build gender equitable worship communities. Professor Ali earned her PhD in religious studies from Boston University and also served as a visiting postgraduate student in Islamic studies at the University of Edinburgh. And prior to that, she earned a master's degree in Islamic studies from Washington University in St. Louis. Now, audience members are free to use the Q&A feature on Zoom throughout this event to write questions to our speaker, which I will be reviewing, and we will get to as many audience questions as we can before we conclude this event at approximately 7:15 Central Time. And so now let me present our renowned speaker, Professor Zareena Grewal.
Well, thanks so much. I am such a fan of Dr. Murray Griffith, and I'm so honored to be invited by her and the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. And I also wanted to thank Sandy Jones for making everything move so smoothly, and I'm very excited to be in conversation after this talk with my wonderful colleague, Tazeen Ali. And so I just wanted to say, I have to say that I really wish that we could be together, of course, as we've been saying over and over again all year through this pandemic. This is particular, I think, a moment where we're all really missing that communion that happens in real life. But I'm happy, still grateful to be able to come and Zoom from my home in New Haven, which I wanted to just mark sits on the traditional lands of the Quinnipiac people. And what I'm sharing today is work that thinks about race in U.S. empire and religion, and it is very much a work in progress. And I'm just so appreciative to have so many friends in the audience, colleagues who have supported me for so many years, and also any of you who are taking the time to go through one more Zoom session. I really appreciate it. So let me just jump in. You'll see there on in the photograph there, you may recognize this viral photo of Lakota scholar activist Nick Estes and Navajo scholar activist Melanie Yazzie, who, in response to what was called the Muslim ban, started the hashtag No Ban on Stolen Land as part of the nationwide protests at airports. So when he was interviewed by CBC, Estes said people were singing things like "This land is your land" or "The Star Spangled Banner," and it was a very jarring experience for a lot of Native folks that were there. It didn't accurately tell the story of exclusion and banning people and whose land it actually belongs to. Explaining why he joined the protest and took in a few Muslim refugee families from Syria to an indigenous welcoming ceremony. He said, "It's not that we have to say we're pro-immigration for people to come and steal our lands. It means that if people are going to come here and coexist peacefully, it has to be on the terms of the people whose land it is to begin with. We recognize the Muslim refugees' humanity in distinction to the U.S., which claims exclusive ownership over who and what counts as human." The welcoming ceremony was also a way to reclaim indigenous sovereignty. He went on to say, "It means something different, much different, if you're being welcomed by the original peoples versus a colonial government. It means that the United States, as a settler nation, does not have the final say on who or what comes into the country because it's not theirs to own. When we do that as indigenous people, it's reclaiming our sovereignty, our citizenship, and more importantly, our kinship." So, of course, the executive order ended under Biden, but we know that the conditions that produced it remain intact, and those conditions are, of course, not new. My friend and colleague, Junaid Rana, reminds us that the figure of the Muslim as a religious and racialized other can be traced back to 1492, and other scholars have also written about this. The history of the very idea of race developed out of religious sentiments in which the Muslim Moor and the Indian and the so-called New World were racialized against one another in a triangulation with the white European. And as my colleague Greta LaFleur demonstrates, sodomy had considerable power as a racializing figure. She argues the criminalization of sodomy may have derived from its association with Muslims. So we're thinking about the ways in which the category of the Muslim is both loaded racially and sexually in the American imagination. So the historical movement toward a modern conception of race formed the emergent racial capitalism that was the springboard for European expansion, settler colonialism, and quote-unquote New World slavery. And I'm sure many of you know that roughly 30% of the enslaved Africans brought to the Americas were Muslims. So I want to talk a little bit, just for a moment, about one of those enslaved Africans. Omar ibn Said, son of a wealthy farmer, spent over 25 years as a prolific scholar and Muslim religious leader in Senegal before he was captured and sold into slavery. Forcibly converted to Christianity, Said would write Quranic verses and pass them off as the Lord's Prayer in Arabic as souvenirs for devout Christian settlers. Now, out of all of his Arab manuscripts, he's best known for his autobiographical essay. Written in 1831, it is the only known Arabic autobiography penned by an enslaved African in the U.S., and it reflects his lifelong devotion to Islam. And so he begins it actually with a chapter called Surah al-Mulk, a chapter from the Quran which states that only God has sovereignty over human beings. So as I said, what I'm going to talk today he figures in the project, although he won't be the focus of my talk today. I'm going to be talking mostly about artwork, but the project is in relation to a lot of conversations I've been having over several years, including this initiative that I'm part of at the University of Toronto named Reading Muslims. The name is coined by my friend and colleague Anwar Ayman, and I borrow the title with his permission today. So in the contemporary context, when we talk about the racialization of Islam as the reading of Muslim bodies or those presumed to be Muslim, such as Sikhs in the context of the global war on terror, we can talk about the anxieties and political stakes of modern liberal states around also how Muslims read their texts. And of course, my colleague John Bowen also writes about this. But we think about, that's what my first book is partly about. And I'm sure many of you know some of Mahmoud's wonderful article where she analyzes how right-wing think tanks are troubled not only by jihadists, but by moderate Muslims theologically invested in the truth of their scripture, the kinds of people who will be in fasting this Ramadan. And so although that first book foregrounded Muslim debates about authority, and then the Western discourses about Islam or the reform of Islam or the crisis of Islam were kind of the backdrop. This book flips it, where I really am thinking about these discourses that are described as Islamophobic or anti-Muslim racist discourses, Orientalist. And so I just wanted to say a little bit about I've already been kind of signaling the ways the questions around periodization that I'm thinking through, but also about terminology. And so that's why I would say I'm thinking out loud with you. I have for many years been with a cohort of scholars who really have been critiquing the use of the category of Islamophobia. Because it frames discrimination against Muslims as a phobia, which suggests that it's a problem of individual bias or individual fear. And so we've been recommending that people shift to talking about anti-Muslim racism because it highlights how it's interrelated with other forms of racism, whether it's anti-Arab, anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-Latinx, anti-Indigenous racisms. And, so I've been following, we're trying to think intersectionally about this. And of course, we think about anti-Muslim racism as a product of settler societies and states engaged in imperial warfare across the globe, but also within the US's own borders as well. But I'm at the point in the project now where I am starting to rethink my aversion to Islamophobia and its antonym Islamophilia. So these terms do something that anti-Muslim racism, which I think is a bit clunky, doesn't quite do, which is that they center the idea of religious excess, which I think is a key component to discourses about Islam. In other words, and it's particularly in the American culture wars. So depending on the particular flavor of one's Orientalist longings or fears, the Quran could be a book that is excessive in its cruel punishments, or too much law, or it's excessively misogynistic, or it could be excessively beautiful, or excessively musical, or there's other ways in which you'll see this in the cases that I'm going to talk about today. And so, I guess whatever the relevant ideological program demands of it, the Quran can be that. In other words, the Quran is a kind of cultural football that's being kicked back and forth in these culture wars. That's what I'm arguing. Whether that be the religion is false religion, bad religion, in the sense that all religion is bad, or a religion of peace. And all of these invocations, whether they're by Christians, atheists, and what Professor Lee Schmidt calls religious liberals, respectively, the idea is this excess is there. And I do think that Islamophobia or Islamophilia, or maybe Quranophobia and Quranophilia are categories that are capturing those Orientalist projections and the idea of excess, of too much, of, one way of thinking about it is that, the story of how Islam became the most religion-y of all the religions, or in the same way the Quran becomes like the ultimate scripture. So like if all scriptures have, are filled with punishments, or they have elements of misogyny or other things, the Quran is conceived as being the most of the one that has the most. And so along with that, on the other side, there's also this idea of the Quran being not merely a book, but a great book, a scripture and part of this universal heritage, but also that itself is a kind of confused discourse, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Is it a legal book? Is the Quran full of law? So I'm going to be kind of wrestling with the use of these terms over the course of this presentation, and I really look forward to your reactions and thoughts about these questions too, because I am still very much thinking out loud with you here. And I just wanted to take a step back for a moment and say something about the scholarship on religion and the scholarship on race, and the ways in which I situate myself in anthropology, the anthropology of Islam, anthropology of the secular, but also in ethnic studies and American studies, and then also in religious studies. And so when I read across these different interdisciplinary formations on work on religion and work on race, I have found this kind of convergence, and others have too, where they're kind of moving in the same direction from different positions. So scholarship on race has moved away from adjudicating the biological and socially constructed nature of race to focus on racialization. In other words, how people, and as I'm going to argue, objects become racialized. And in the study of religion, we've moved from adjudicating the biological and socially constructed nature of race to the study of we would move from documenting beliefs and communities and practices identified as religion to studying secularism, how the very possibilities of what religion can be are historically contingent and are managed by power externally and internally. And one of the thinkers that I'm thinking with, to kind of think through the ways in which secularism operates as this force or presence that clears the space for the absence of religion, but also sets the racial terms by which religion can be spoken and heard, is Vincent Lloyd, who writes, in the US, whiteness is secular, the secular is white. The unmarked racial category, the unmarked religious category jointly mark their others. Or put another way, the desire to stand outside religion and the desire to stand outside race are completely are complementary delusions, for the seemingly outside is in fact the hegemonic. So that's kind of the analytical frame which I want to foreground as we go through the different cases that we're going to talk about today. So I'm just going to go back. So when we talk about the culture wars, there's different periodizations. One is really starting in the 60s, and I am still toying with how to periodize this, but I don't want it to be a post 9/11 story, because it certainly is not. And so I want to begin today with the 1997 case of when a coalition of 16 American organizations petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court to have the image of Prophet Muhammad with a Quran in one hand and a curved sword in the other sandblasted off a frieze on the north wall overlooking the nation's central legal chamber. So this frieze was designed in the 1930s by a German-American artist, Adolf Weinman, and features 18 of the world's great lawmakers. This includes Charlemagne and Moses and others. And in his rendering, the Quran here is presented as a great book of law in the story of human civilization. So there's actually been a lot of art historical criticism of this piece, and that's generally reading Weinman's frieze in Masonic fraternal terms, arguing it both deployed Orientalist tropes, but also expressed sympathetic religious, political, and moral meanings, which challenge the Christian demonization of Muhammad as a violent. Oops, did you lose me there? Can you hear me? Okay. Anyways, this idea that it's that Muhammad is this kind of false prophet or quintessential infidel, and so the frieze is read, or Weinman's argument is read as a kind of argument from Weinman about American civil religion, and so the frieze offers a kind of phraseological model for civilization in which American justice is the culmination of a progressive ancient heritage symbolized by a horizontal multicultural procession of historic figures of great men and their great books, united by the providential idea that God is the ultimate sovereign lawgiver. So, of course, this landed in a very particular way in the 90s during the culture wars in that period. And American Muslim organizations' objection was not over Weinman's depiction of the Quran, but of Muhammad. So the Muslim Americans protested that having a frieze in an official location was insensitive to the Islamic prohibition, which, of course, is not shared by all Muslims, against displaying images of the Prophet. And then they also mentioned that the Prophet was wielding a sword. I'm not sure that I would call that wielding, but in any case, they did feel that it perpetuated the stereotype that Muslims were intolerant conquerors and the Orientalist myth that the religion of Islam was spread by the sword. I should also say that Muhammad is not the only person in the frieze holding a sword. So American Muslim litigants had precedent, and they were being led by CARE in this moment. But even in 1955, a diplomatic request from Egypt, Pakistan, and Indonesia resulted in the removal of a 50-year-old freestanding statue of Muhammad as lawgiver, made by a sculptor, Charles Albert Lopez, and that was removed from the roof of the Federal Appellate Court in Madison Square in Manhattan. So, in any case, what happens with this is that the judge makes a ruling against the Muslim plaintiffs, explaining that the figure represented an honor rather than a form of idol worship, and the sword was a general symbol of justice. He also noted that any alterations in the frieze would not only destroy the artistic integrity of the whole, but it would also violate a 1949 statute against the removal of statues from the court's property. However, the ruling was riddled with a contradiction. In his letter, the judge insisted that the figure was, quote, a well-intentioned attempt by the sculptor to honor Muhammad. But then in a separate part of it, he has a kind of a concession to the Muslim litigants, and there was a brochure that was passed out to the tourists and visitors, which reworded the figure to say that the figure, in fact, quote, bears no resemblance to Muhammad. And it explains that Muslims have a generally strong aversion to pictured representations of their prophet. So I should have to say, there were no riots, there was no big protests after this came down, nothing happened, and no flag burnings, not even an appeal. Aside from the fact that the case proves that, once again, which we have to keep proving over and over again, I guess, that violence associated with the Danish cartoons and other depictions of Muhammad can't be naturalized as spontaneous or explained by a so-called Muslim taboo. What I'm interested today is the contradictory statements here as to whether or not the sculpture was an authentic representation and a negative one. Was it honoring Muhammad or not? And is the Quran a great book of law? And it seems to me that the judge and the people that wrote the brochure are not quite sure that Muhammad deserves the honor that the artist presumably bestowed upon him. And so this kind of confusion is the kind of stuff that I'm really looking at. So the failed lawsuit did elicit a fatwa, which is a non-binding legal opinion from a prominent Iraqi-American Sunni cleric, Imam Taha Jabr al-Awani, who was at that time the chairman of the Islamic Fiqh Council of North America. This is a kind of umbrella organization charged with handling, legal and ethical issues that come up in Muslim life in North America. So his fatwa echoed the ruling from the judge, defending the spirit of the frieze as respectful in contrast to so many negative representations of the prophet. The frieze, he argued, situated Islam within a, quote, common universal heritage of law and justice. Al-Awani said nothing about the fact that the Quran was not compiled as a book in Muhammad's lifetime, as the frieze depicts, nor does he clarify that the Quran is not really a book of law. And this has become an important talking point for Muslim apologists in the wake of the wave of Sharia bans that we had since 2009. And so then I'm sort of jumping now forward to a different set of culture war debates where the idea of the Quran as a book of law figures very differently right now that Sharia is actually a household word. So in a CNN interview in 2016, Kayleigh McKinney, who's a Trump surrogate and political commentator, quoted Andrew McCarthy, a National Review columnist, as a source for her statement that, quote, 90% of the Quran is a legal document and is Sharia. Now, McCarthy, by the way, denies making this claim. So in response to that, another Muslim religious leader, American Muslim religious leader, Joe Bradford, argued that according to his calculations, out of the 6,236 verses of the Quran, less than 9%, he said about 500, are about law or legal issues. So I think Bradford's point is generally undisputed by his peers, and I have not counted the verses myself, but I'm most interested in the transformation of these tactics of rehabilitating the Quran among American Muslims in the past 20 years, from Awani insisting and affirming the Quran is a great book of law to now Bradford and others arguing the Quran is benign precisely because it's not a book of law. And that is, part of what I'm trying to track. And so this is why I wanted to start with Vincent Lloyd's quote. So we see the ways in which figures who, the ways in which these Western discourses are shaping American Muslim debates. So I will, okay, let me just move a little bit. So, most of today's talk is about the sorry, I'm just moving a little bit faster than I expected to. Most of the things that I'm talking about today are about the culture wars, but I also don't want us to forget the actual wars that are happening in the war on terror. And so over the course of doing research in my book, I've been collecting an archive of protests featuring highly ritualized Quran burnings, such as the one that happens on every 9/11, or this one at the White House in the wake of the San Bernardino shootings. And I just wanted to mark for you that without fail, there's always a counter protest that draws a larger crowd and who's there to burn the Quran. And often the Quran, doused in gasoline, is kind of rescued by someone before it's actually burned. And this even became a club track by somebody named Jacob Isom in 2010. So you can actually hear the song on the radio. I won't share it for you because it's not very good. Another thing that happens is, and this is just another kind of incident way of making this larger point, that the Quran is one of these most, I would argue, one of the most iconic objects in contemporary U.S. culture wars. As far as Islamic objects, I think only second to the hijab. So one of the things that you see happening is people buying Qurans at Barnes & Noble or other places and taking them home and shooting them. And so these videos invariably always featuring white men, almost always, were on YouTube and were last year moved from YouTube to Pornhub. So we might also think about this idea of shooting the Quran for sport, why those videos move to Pornhub. And again, I'm thinking about this category of excess, right? In other words, what's happening there. And then to go back to what I was saying before about the actual wars, right? So I want to remind you again of a relatively minor controversy in 2008, which maybe some of you will remember. A U.S. military sniper's desecration of the Quran and use of the book for target practice in Baghdad led to widespread protests within and beyond the city, threatening the U.S. military's fragile alliance with the Sunni forces at the time. And so you had this former college quarterback and Christian major, General Jeffrey Hammond, who made a very public apology to the Iraqi protesters. And then Colonel Ted Martin deferentially kissed the Quran before this crowd, before handing it to the local sheikh, who actually was quite nervously accepting the Quran and the apology. And so at that moment, on CNN, the B-roll and these other images, these two starkly opposed images of the shredded Quran pierced by American soldiers' bullets and the video of a uniform-clad, decorated colonel kissing the Quran, are circulating together on CNN and other mainstream media. And it just, sparked a debate about whether the general's conciliatory gesture was evidence of American characteristic tolerance of all faiths, right? Just going back to the freeze for a second, or merely a pragmatic military tactic intended to stave off a violent backlash from Sunni insurgents. And so the debate turned on whether American efforts to promote tolerance confused respectful behavior with reverent behavior. And there was a lot of anxiety about whether American values and ideals and even secularism itself were being compromised in the service of, the promotion of tolerance and the promotion of democracy. So I'm going to focus mostly on a series of artists in the next part of the talk, but I just wanted to signal that, I am trying to think through policy as another kind of cultural object in this this project is so unwieldy, but it's such a huge and diverse archive. So the kinds of things that I'm thinking about are different policies, like, the Quran in prisons. What's the policy around that? There's a lot of controversy, and I can talk about this in the Q&A. But really, what I see in these debates around tolerance, around the Quran, around these kind of Quran controversies that I'm tracking, they really, sort of pivot around two ideas. The first set of debates is about how much we as Americans should tolerate them, Muslims in the U.S. These are the kind of domestic debates. And then the second set of debates is how we, which are happening simultaneously, are about how the U.S. government should be making the so-called Muslim world more tolerant, right? And so, and I also want to think about that relationship between what happens, the violence of the state, and then how that gets enacted. So in other words, the desecration of the Quran at Guantanamo, where it's being, ripped, dropped in toilets, etc., all these other, things that are happening there, the shooting of the Quran in Iraq, and then, to this, the people on Reddit who are confessing, I just, bought a Quran to shit on it, or other kinds of things for these people that are posting the videos on YouTube or on Pornhub. And so, what I'm trying to think with here is a sort of drawing on spillers, like the kind of fleshiness of the Quran. And so what I'm hoping is that this book will deepen our understanding of the complexity and diversity of Americans' political and cultural interests over time, and to show that they're complex and they're neither uniformly negative nor always in the service of U.S. empire. And so that requires me to actually, kind of do like an epidaure social life of things, where I'm actually tracking particular Qur'ans, Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an, Malcolm X's Qur'an, etc. But also just, trying to kind of just track it as a discourse, as a discursive trope that comes up in all of these different debates. And so that fleshiness of the Qur'an has, brought me to think and read more carefully in performance studies and culture studies. And so one of the thinkers that I'm thinking with is Anne Cheng, who writes in her fantastic book, Ornamentalism, that those of us invested in the critique of power have long been alert to the crisis of persons who've been turned into things, but we should also attend to the ways things have been taken for persons and how this impacts our ideas about human ontology and aliveness. And so, it is chilling to just absorb that those shot up Qur'ans, of course, stand in for Black and brown bodies, the shooter's desire to kill. But what I want us to also remember, and this is what I'm deeply interested in, the mirroring that happens. In other words, the text object of the Qur'an often stands in for Muslim bodies in both Islamophobic and Islamophilic registers. So the focus on the Quran is a racial object that Americans who are not Muslim need, is being supplemented by an analysis of the racial experiences of American Muslims vis-a-vis their racialized scripture. Again, I'm not going to talk about this today, but I just wanted to signal that as something that I'm happy to take up in the Q&A. So one of the things that happened 20 years ago, 9/11, was that there was a public rush to buy the Quran with bookstores backordered for weeks. And even though President Bush was sort of saying the 9/11 hijackers don't represent real Islam, many Americans felt an urgent need to read the Quran themselves. So on the one hand, people were arguing, well, this is natural, and it's a reflection of American tolerance of different faiths and curiosity. But on the other hand, critics, and I agree with these critics, is that it's actually argued it's not a natural reflex, but a cultural reflex to turn to the Quran to understand terrorism and to search for the verses that made this bad thing happen, rather than to consider a modern historical account of Al-Qaeda. And I'm thinking of Mamdani and others who've made this argument really well. And I want to take it further and say that this phenomenon reflects a characteristically American scripturalist tendency towards religion, as well as a racist logic that depends on two very different understandings of culture. And here's where Mamdani's good Muslim, bad Muslim, and culture talk comes in, the idea that we have culture, their culture has them, right? So in order to explore why so many Americans were drawn to essentialist cultural explanations of the attacks rather than political ones, we have to look at what we can call Americans determined incomprehension, to borrow Melanie McAllister's term. And I think that's what this artist, Munir Fatmi's installation is doing. I hope this will be the cover of the book. And it just makes me think about, that Barnes and Noble aisle that I invoked earlier, that you could have an American trying to buy a Quran to understand 9/11 in the same aisle and reaching at the same time for someone who wants to buy the Quran so that he can go and shoot it in his backyard and post the video on YouTube or Pornhub. And I guess this desire to read the Quran myself, I'm arguing, has become a kind of pervasive liberal form of political witnessing after 9/11. And to this day, I have a very long list of celebrities who've claimed to have read the Quran, and then they go on to say something defending it or not. And so I think the idea of reading the Quran myself operates as a kind of racial alibi and a deflection from accusations of bigotry, in much the same way that the invocation of having Black friends or a Black friend is simultaneously used as a license to make a racist claim while being presumably insulated from scrutiny, as well as a claim to the objective authorities. This goes back to Vincent Lloyd's idea of the role of the outsider, or the white outsider. And it's also a form of cosmopolitan social capital, which positions the reader to recognize the essential value or its lack. In other words, it's non-Muslim Americans' claims to have read the Quran that are the scaffolding for arguments both for and against tolerating Muslim minorities, both for and against demonizing, or both for demonizing and defending Islam. And the fact that such claims to intimate knowledge of Islam and Muslims center the scripture rather than the people is typically left uninterrogated. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to quickly move through some artists. I have a chapter that goes through different kinds of translations of the Quran. So like the how to read the Quran for Dummies, the Islamophobic version, the Complete Infidel's Guide to the Quran. But then these Islamophilic or Quranophilic visual artists by white American atheists. Those are the people that I'm going to talk about today, who I'm arguing have created sympathetic representations or translations of the Quran. And so the three people I'm going to talk about are Santo Burke, who's a painter, weaver Meg Hitchcock, and graphic novelist Craig Thompson. So what I'm arguing is that by abstracting and aestheticizing the text object, these visual artists translate the Quran and make it more readable in order to make a set of humanistic claims about the Quran's universality and its aesthetic power to inspire. So Santo Burke has produced this fascinating and unique illuminated Quran based on what he calls his fake, naive stance. The Quran ought to be able to speak to him unmediated and without context, just as a Bible in a hotel drawer might. So what emerges is a highly personalized rendering of every 2 pages of the Quran as a standalone painting. And he purposely and strategically chose not to study the meaning of the Quran to Muslims. And in fact, Muslim viewers of the exhibit report, they found a kind of disconnect between his paintings and the Quran they know. So the kind of trick of it is to look for the verse that you're reading, because of course the Quran is not a linear narrative, to figure out which verse connects to the background. So just to give you a sense of the ways in which Burke is playing with Islamic aesthetic forms, Persian miniatures, calligraphy, but also juxtaposing them with graffiti and banal images of everyday life, Burke makes the Quran itself, I've argued, an anthropological mirror, making the exotic familiar and the familiar exotic, scrutinizing the beliefs and behaviors of ordinary Americans in much the same ways they typically scrutinize Muslim societies. So this is the Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Quran, and you see there it's right above a knot of highways in Los Angeles, maybe recognizable to some of you. And so overall, if you look at the project, the idea is that the images operate as a kind as parables or as fictionalized documentary evidence for the Quran's messages. The jihad verses will be over images of the U.S. military in Iraq, Guantanamo Bay. This is the militarized border of Arizona, and that even takes us to outer space. Here's an image where Prophet Noah's flood might easily be dismissed as an abstraction. So Burke is trying to make it real and immediate for a contemporary audience through scenes of Hurricane Katrina's devastation. What's interesting to me about the American Quran is that it tests both Islam's claims to universality and the universal citizenship promised by American democracy. If Islam is for all times and all places, as Muslims claim, can a white guy who is not Muslim accept the Quran's invitation to read, reflect on, and interpret its verses without being accused of cultural trespass, without getting canceled? Or will Muslim protest that this message and book is only ours, it's our cultural property, which is, of course, in direct conflict with the Quran says about itself? And so I should say that, Burke remains unconvinced of any of the claims of divinity in the Quran, and is a staunch atheist. However, he is seeking answers to big questions. This is a 10-year project, and the paintings are very reflective, show a lot of deep thinking and reflection and meditation on the words of the Quran. So he's trying to show readers that the ways the Quran's history, not its metaphysics, moves him, and his language is visual, not oral. The kind of driving question is, does the Quran have anything to say to a 21st century American? And so when you look at this example of a surah or chapter in the Quran that's called the cheaters, the verse is, woe to the cheaters who demand full measure when they take from others, but short them when they measure for them. And then, of course, the backdrop is this foreclosed home. The answer clearly is yes. He's saying this is a book everyone should read. This is a book that matters to everyone. So I'm going to come back to thinking about Burke, but I'm going to move now to Meg Hitchcock, who's reconstructed a rendering of the Book of Revelations from letter cutouts of the Quran using a gallery, walls, floors, and ceiling as her easel. So Burke was fusing genres, drawing on Persian miniatures and calligraphy and American graffiti. Hitchcock is fusing tapestry and collage techniques to create a kind of knitted rope of competing scriptures. And like Burke, her exhibit foregrounds the words of scripture as the primary object of visual interest. And like Burke, the words the viewers encounters are disjointed and jarring due to the way the braiding interrupts the narrative. whether it's the Bible as the Quran or the Quran as the Bible, and she also does a whole other series of books. So part of what I'm interested in is the way in which, like, what books is the Quran held up against? So in that frieze, what are the other books? Sometimes it's the Constitution, sometimes it's the Bible, sometimes it's something else. And for Meg Hitchcock, she has a whole bunch of novels that she also puts up against the Quran, so we can talk about that too. So she's trying to make an argument about the interchangeability of the scriptures of these two universal traditions, Islam and Christianity, and also Buddhism and other traditions that she draws on, and also the malleability and easy manipulation of scriptures. So she says the Quran can say anything. It's a book of peace. It's a book of war. You can make the Quran and the Bible say anything you want, depending on, depending on what you bring to it. Sorry, my head is in the front of the thing. Okay, and then she goes on to say about the project, I don't see it as a sacrilege. I see that I'm taking the Quran and the Bible and elevating them to something that is higher than either, which is art. So right there you see a kind of political theology, secular claim. So in other cases, here's one that I bet you can guess why I don't love this one. This is the Quran and the feminine mystique, right? So this is the kind of work that she's doing. She also uses Emily Dickinson novels and other texts that she juxtaposes or uses as cutouts to depict the Quran. So the primarily political message of both Burke's installation and Hitchcock's installation is that, in both of these, the white American atheists are interpolated as the proper, rational, free-thinking readers, and therefore leave intact the race-thinking and racial anxieties about Muslims who read. So I think that's especially true here. I mean, of course, as I said, Burke did have a kind of critique of U.S. empire, but like Hitchcock, there was a real emphasis on the interchangeable quality of scriptures, and Hitchcock and Burke are both showing us how they have the freedom to borrow across traditions. Just as in Burke's case, it was the freedom to read without context. And that, to me, serves, I read it as both a challenge to the religious authenticity of the Quran. It's a kind of like, inspire me if you can. But it's also an artistic claim to license that's unbound by any tradition or any community. And so that's something that I am trying to think critically about. So I will move now to graphic novelist Craig Thompson's novel Habibi. And if you actually, I don't know if anyone, if Zoom will, if you can really see it very well, but it's actually, the book itself looks like a Quran. It's not, there we go. Can you kind of see that? So this is a love story, a graphic novel in which the two characters enter a futuristic dystopia where the world is swimming in garbage and water bundling companies are hoarding water, and while the world dies of thirst. And it's a very moving story. It's very beautiful. There's a lot of deeply disturbing, graphic, violent imagery and sexual imagery juxtaposed against depictions of Quranic stories. And he's drawing on Orientalist tropes, Arabic calligraphy, and Quranic narrative as a purely aesthetic point of departure, and not in an ironic way. So Thompson's story is, compelling in many ways and beautifully executed, but he's really depicting the Quran as a book of stories and magic numbers, closely related to the biblical narratives, beautiful but also troubling. I teach in a course at Yale his other book, Blankets, which similarly takes the Bible for a kind of coming of age story, and it's an incredible graphic novel, and I love it. I don't love Habibi the same way, which we can talk about. So while Thompson's story is a profound political critique of racism, modern day human trafficking, and environmental abuse by global corporations, he doesn't bring the Quran's words to bear on any of this. In other words, he's depicting the Quran as beautiful, alluring, and complex, but the social justice message of the Quran is left out of the book, and the Quran is left out of politics. As you see here, it's just that these words are kind of raining down on the two characters. So although, as I said, Burke and Thompson do make explicit critiques of U.S. empire, and in a way, what I'm struck by is how profoundly depoliticized these artistic works are when we consider the way they use the Quran. Their political courage is framed as their willingness to work with the Quran and risk offending the sensibilities of Muslims who are presumably too quick to erupt into violence in the face of art that they don't understand or don't like. So these non-Muslim artists' works that draw on the Quran fixate on the Quran as a text object that does not require study, but requires aestheticization in order to make it accessible and benign. their work stands in sharp contrast to the politics of Muslim artists. This is what I'm going to end on, such as Pakistani artist Huma Baba. So Baba's work uses fantasy and the divine as sources from which to juxtapose the ordinary with the extraordinary, to index the I'm almost sorry to index the fraught U.S.-Pakistan alliance. Baba, known mostly for her sculptures, offers a political critique of global politics, war, environmental catastrophes, and the effects of racial capitalism. So in this particular piece, the garbage bag is both the veil and the prison, the hands outstretched before the body in sujood. There could be like a ghastly kind of tale that indexes the ways in which the prostrating Muslim body is made animal and deprived of human rights in places like Pakistan, Guantanamo Bay, the carceral borders of the U.S. and Fortress Europe. So this sculpture is a commentary on how the war on terror is related to the late modernism of neoliberal capitalism that accelerates decay, ecological disaster, and genocide. And I'm not arguing about the merits of Baba's work in comparison to the other works shown. Rather, I want to highlight a key difference in how the Quran is conceived and approached artistically. Baba's work is one, I think, that captures the orality of the Quran. Which is such a constitutive part of lived Islam, something that I think is lost in all the other work. For me, I mean, just incredible that a sculpture can make me hear a sound. But for me, and maybe for some of you, I'm overcome with chills as I think of and absorb the work's political meanings, but I can also hear the Quran in my mind's ear. And so I will end there, and I will just say that for those of you who are celebrating Ramadan Mubarak, this is the month of the Quran, and I hope this was of interest and benefit to you that came and joined me today.
Thank you so much, Professor Greywal, for such a wonderful and insightful talk. I think you've given us all so much to think about, and I'm really looking forward to this book. I wanted to start off by asking if you could talk about how the social currency of the Quran in the culture wars in the contemporary American moment fits into this broader ongoing process of racialization of US Muslims over the course of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries.
So when we think about the culture wars, we think about a book like Moral Combat, which is about Christians and their debates about sex and America and its role in the world. And what I want to argue is that actually Muslims, like queers and like other minorities, racial and sexual minorities, are one of the fault lines in these culture wars, and they haunt them. And so. To me, I'm not taking on the periodization of the culture wars because the project has many different dimensions. So it's not purely a kind of culture war account, but I don't think you really get at the culture wars fully until you think about Muslims too. And so that's in some ways what the project is doing, is trying to think about, what kind of figure is the Muslim in the culture wars, in these national debates and actually transnational debates. So just to give a kind of sense, one of the objects that I did not show today, but that I showed in the talk a couple days ago was there's like a meme of a toilet paper roll, and the Quran is printed on it. So the idea is, even though it's a meme, it's not real. You can't actually buy this. It conjures up the feeling that, if I hate Muslims and I hate the Quran, what I really want to do is, take a shit on the Quran. You can, imagine it. That's what it's conjuring for you. Well, they're actually in this, in the early 80s, there was similar kinds of, it wasn't a meme, but there were like posters or little like jokes with a toilet paper with Ayatollah Khomeini's face on them, and others have written about this too. So I'm trying to kind of trace this. I'm interested in the racial scripts that frame these culture war debates, and the rituals and the racial performances. That's part of what I'm trying to get at, and I think it reveals a lot about U.S. empire, the ways in which race works. In other words, how do we move from the racialization of the body of Ayatollah Khomeini to the racialization of the object that stands in for the body, which is the book, the Quran, and so that's how I'm trying to think it through. And I don't think it's only an American story, right? That's my case studies, but obviously these things, I mean, I think John Bowen is here, so he can tell us about France. We certainly hear right now all kinds of, debates in France about Islam, the need for its reform, the way it's a polluting religion, it's polluting population, all of those things. And so that's what drew me to this material and this project. And so I'm trying to get at it. And I think another way of coming at it is that, we don't think of the racialization of Islam as like something that's done to Muslims. It's because sometimes people will say, well, what do you mean the racialization of Islam? What about white Muslims? Are you calling them racialized? That's like missing the point for me. The idea is the racialization of Islam is something that pervades our society, parallel to the ways in which anti-Black racism pervades our society, and so we want to think about it in those larger terms that are, that the way it constitutes all of our debates and museum displays and art displays and all of these different things.
Yeah, thank you. I think that idea of continuity is so compelling, and I appreciated you framing early on in your talk that this is not a post 9/11 story, and kind of tracing those continuities throughout the decades is a really important way to kind of think about a lot of these questions that you raise. I'm also really interested in how gender fits into this understanding of the Quran as an object, as this football that's being thrown around in these current debates. And you mentioned that these events of staged violence, of burning or shooting the Quran, are largely perpetrated by white men. And I'm wondering how we can think about anti-Muslim violence enacted in this way as a performance of white masculinity, especially given that to the perpetrators of such violence, the Quran is often seen as a text that denigrates and oppresses women. And so I'm wondering about what are some of the ways that the Quran is also gendered in the culture wars?
Yeah, I mean, the material that's about the bigots is just so rich and provocative, which of course they want it to be. And it immediately sort of brings it to mind and brings these questions of, how is whiteness and masculinity in a particular kind of muscular masculinity, right? Muscular Christianity, but also a muscular atheism and other forms being, constituted against the Muslim, against the Quran, against this population. But I also want to remind everyone that, and that's why I was talking about the mirroring, this is also happening among liberals, right? So for me, Meg Hitchcock, you spent years cutting up books to assemble the Quran as the Bible, or the Quran as the Constitution, or the Constitution as the Quran, or all these things. And then she's kind of towards the end of the project, doing this thing where you get a niqab, with the feminist Mystique. I don't know what, I mean, I don't know. So I guess to me, she's reproducing the same thing, which is this book is excessive in its containment, suppression, constraints against women. I don't think that's challenged, or it's what does it mean to take I don't know. I just think it's actually reproducing the same kind of discourse or ideas as what the bigots are doing. Although she imagines herself as kind of giving a sympathetic account and thinking about that, the position there is, well, all religions are bad and all religions are sexist. But even there, she still has to kind of put that, burqa-clad woman. It's just one of the only figural examples in the whole installation, and most of them are not like that. So why that figure? Why the Muslim woman?
Yeah, that's so interesting, because it seems like on the one hand, in the context where there's bullet holes through the Quran is standing in for brown men who are deemed as dangerous and threatening. And that really disturbing detail that you included about these videos now ending up on pornography sites, it's almost like then the Quran is feminized as something to desecrate a woman's body almost.
Yeah, I would love someone to help me. So I also have to say, one of the things I'm looking at, so that, moving to Pornhub is with one piece. There's also Quran porn. And so this is, things where, this is not these are things that people do themselves. So they'll have either ejaculating on a Quran, or a white woman through the pages of the Quran. Sorry to be so graphic, but it's what is all this this is why the category of excess for me is so rich right now. I'm really thinking with that. It's like, what is it? What's all this pleasure? What's all this, like, all of the erotics of this, these racial performances. I want to think more carefully about them. I don't have a handle on it. Like, I'm still trying to think through, because sometimes it's like, oh, is the claim there that, like, I can, I have all these sexual freedoms that you don't have because of this book, and so look at me doing it? Or is it that I can, desecrate the Quran? I mean, I'm not, or is it about a certain kind of desire for the abject Muslim woman? Or do you know what I mean? It's just, I myself am kind of confused about how to think about some of these things. And maybe you don't need to solve all those puzzles. I mean, I'll tell you one fragment that's been bothering me for years is one of the things that I found was there's an episode of The Simpsons where Homer Simpson goes to the freezer, opens the freezer door, and pulls out a Quran and reads a couple pages and then puts it back. It's a total non sequitur in the rest of the narrative, and I don't know what that means. I just feel like it's just like one other example of how the Quran is actually everywhere all the time, and it itself just brings in all of this stuff. So you don't even need to go to these extreme examples of the porn or the, another thing I'm looking at is like things like bumper stickers. Like, it's just the Quran pervades American culture, popular culture, so in so many ways. And I think you're right, Tazeen, to say that it's always racial and gendered and sexual. But I guess as somebody who is, my wheelhouse is like interviewing people and doing ethnographic field research. And so I am, learning from my friends in literature and in culture studies and in performance studies about how to think about close readings of some of this material.
Yeah, thank you. And, I kind of want to linger on this question of whiteness a little bit and how it operates in the Islamophilic context, as you've mentioned, connected to this question of excess. I'm really struck by your analysis of white atheist artists like Sandow Birk. I wasn't familiar with Hitchcock before this presentation. And I'm really, struck by this analysis that the way that these white atheist artists approach the Quran is a way that's very well intentioned towards Muslims, but also completely ignores them. In that they're completely detached from Muslim ways of engaging the Quran. And not only that, they are celebrating that detachment as a marker of their sort of rational neutrality that then authorizes them to make a case for rehabilitating the Quran, as you laid out. And I wanted to see, in your ethnographic work, if you can give us a sense of maybe how American Muslims respond to these projects. Do they embrace them because it has the sort of legitimizing capacity? And what does that say about U.S. Muslim relationships to whiteness? And also, as a second part of that, how does that dynamic change when it's non-white, non-Muslim artists in question?
Oh my God, these are great questions, and so generative, and I have like 20 things in my head, which may or may not be exactly an answer to what you're saying. But I can say, to give you just like an ethnographic example. So in my first book, I talk about how, if there was one verse in the Quran that was like the American Muslim verse, it would be the one about, we've made you into tribes and people so that you will get to know each other, not so that you hate each other, right? And that's sort of this anti-racist verse that is repeated. And I documented this for my first book to show that this verse pops up more frequently than any other verse in Muslim pulp religious literature, in American Muslim pulp religious literature, in khutbahs, sermons, and speeches and ISNA conventions and all. I mean, that's just the verse that everybody just keeps repeating over and over again. So I went into the Burke project knowing that the first painting that would be sold would be the one that would have that verse in it. And so when I went to him and I said, tell me about how the sales have been and who's buying this. And so there was a Muslim American couple and he showed me the painting. And of course, his backdrop is totally unrelated. He actually, for that particular one, did a backdrop of his childhood home in Detroit, the street that he grew up on. It's just like someone shoveling snow and whatever. And he was like, I don't understand why this is the first, like this sold like immediately, because he doesn't understand. And I was like, well, I'll tell you, it's because of this verse is in it. So that's of course the verse American Muslims would want. And of course, it's not only Muslims that have bought the paintings, but that kind of thing where it's just like totally divorced from the lived religion of Muslims is really interesting. And so part of what my ethnographic work was to actually be at the exhibits and to hear and over here and talk to Muslims talking about and explaining things about the Quran to the people they were with who might not be Muslim, or making certain claims about Sunnism or Shiism, making, I mean, so that interactive part of it's interesting. The Muslims would sometimes pray, in at the exhibits. So that was also interesting. But, one of the things that I love about the book, and as I've been showing or giving talks like this at different universities, I often will have Muslim students come up to me and say, you know what, I'm actually scared to read the Quran because I don't want to find a verse or encounter a verse that's like problematic and it's going to make me stop being Muslim. And my response to them is like, if this like artist, atheist, surfer dude can find some inspiration in it, why don't you just crack it open and see what happens? Like, it's, for me, that really indexes the racialization. But in other words, there's basically 10 verses of the Quran that or like 12 maybe, that American bigots have memorized that often get tweeted at me, for example, or any other public Muslim. And it's sad to me that even for American Muslims, that kind of obsessive, that sort of small set of problematic, quote unquote, problematic verses, that's what some American Muslims think the Quran is, or that all it is too. And that to me is really sad. So part of this project for me is actually, and I actually now have the data, because I did work with Pew, to show that American Muslims are asked about problematic verses more than any other religious minority or religious group in the US, right? So in other words, we don't have water coolers anymore, but whatever that proverbial moment is on a plane or at work or at school, where someone's like, can you explain like 434 to me or something like that? I can do that as a religious studies professor pretty well, but for the average Muslim, they may not even know what that verse is. They have no idea what to say. They're like, ah. And so that racial encounter is part of what I'm trying to track.
Yes.
Sorry, can you hear me? Sometimes it's telling me my microphone's not working. Are you able to hear me right now? Okay, good.
Cut out a little bit. Thank you. I think that was actually related to another question I was kind of wondering that you've already answered, in terms of just the sheer fact that now we have a couple of generations of Muslims coming of age in the post 9/11 context, who themselves engage with the Quran in this decontextualized way, that are characterized by these 10 or 12 verses that are about wife beating and killing idol worshippers and cutting off the hands of thieves. That also informs the way that they approach the Quran. And I just, sorry, if we can just go back for a second, I wanted to ask about, that relationship of whiteness between U.S. Muslims and whiteness, because I was specifically thinking about Sawad Abdul Kabir's work, where she references how non-Muslim Black hip hop artists very comfortably and very accurately reference the Quran or Muslim culture in their music in a way that's actually very contextualized and rooted in Muslims' experiences, which kind of stands in direct contrast to what you've just laid out in terms of the white atheist artist. And I wonder how you would situate those non-Muslim Black artists in relation to these white artists, and US Muslims' sort of reception of these two camps.
Yeah, no. So Suad is, of course, my dear friend and valued colleague, and I love her book and teach her book, Muslim Cool, all the time. And there's others too that have done that kind of work, where they're actually like Suhail Dalatsai and others who have looked at the ways in which references to Islam or the Quran specifically, are in hip hop. Hisham 80 is another one. There's several. So that is a kind of field, and I definitely want that to be part of this project, because one of the arguments, and there's probably too many arguments at this stage, but one of the arguments really is about the ways in which part of the whiteness or the racialization of the Quran is about flattening it to a book and a visual page of words, as opposed to that lived experience. I mean, for the average Muslim, their primary, I actually now have the statistical data to back all these things up, because people didn't believe me when I told Pew this, but for the average Muslim, their most kind of common or typical interaction with the Quran is as a sound, either that they're uttering, they're hearing someone else utter, or that they're repeating under their breath in prayer. not like cracking open an actual book and looking at, a page and reading it, although they do that too. But that part of it, the Quran is a necklace. The Quran is, decorates. It's a part of how you decorate your house with verses and calligraphy. Those embodied elements of Quranic experience. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's both Black Muslim and non-Muslim Black artists that are capturing and accessing that because of their proximity and investment, in Muslim communities across the board, and so that's both a political connection, but it's also a social relationship, and that's part of what I think is so striking to me about Hitchcock and Burke and others, where it's very much about like I said, it's inspire me if you can, and it's being able to be the right to be at a remove. So that's why I started with Vincent Lloyd and whiteness as the secular, the outside, the critic, so that, and I feel the same way about when like Madonna says, I've read the Quran and it's X, Y, and Z, like she's, or like, I mean, there's like all, Lindsay Lohan, and there's so many, just like celebrities who, that's their way of saying like Muslims are good, right? And they're not like, oh, my Muslim hairdresser or something. They're like, oh, I've read the Quran and therefore I can speak on the value or merits or lack thereof of this, over a billion people and 1,400 years of history.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that. I see that it's past 7 o'clock, and I wondered, Professor Griffith, if we can turn to questions from the audience. I know you had some questions of your own as well.
Yeah, certainly. And I just want to thank you to Professor Grewal. That was just wonderful and just amazing examples. We could be here all night. And I guess one question that has come up has to do with the Quran in prison. So you mentioned during your talk that you'd be glad to say more about that. And I was just thinking, for so many non-Muslim Americans, this sort of evokes the autobiography of Malcolm X, for instance, and things that have happened since. And on Malcolm X, you probably know that there's a new biography of him just out by Les Payne and his daughter. And one of the critiques that I have just read that we're publishing tomorrow in a review is that the writer, for all its brilliance of this book, it sounds like an amazing biography, calls the Nation of Islam a cult and talks about, in that way. And so, we've got the good Islam, bad Islam, there. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that's such a great question and so rich. I should also say that. So one other thing I'm looking at is oaths, like taking the oath on the Quran and the controversies around that. But there's also a case in Georgia where a state official took an oath on the autobiography of Malcolm X. So I'm also trying to think about, probably won't make it into the book, maybe it'll be an article about the autobiography of Malcolm X as another kind of Islamic great book or scripture, or kind of, the way it operates. And I'm really inspired by a book that just come out on the Anthropology of Scriptures, which follows Alex Haley's roots. To me, there's a kind of a lot of exciting work being done on these kinds of questions, specifically about the Muslims in U.S. prisons. So right after 9/11, there was a sort of short-lived policy where they were worried about Black Muslim men basically reading the Quran and getting inspired and connecting to the terrorists, and so all religious literature in U.S. prisons was like had to be vetted or something like that. And there was like an immediate backlash because it was like, well, wait a minute, this is a violation of rights, and so that was so I'm looking at that kind of spectacular case of what happened. These sort of like policy bombs where I mean, minorities, whether they're racial or sexual minorities, are always the canary in the mine. And when state comes after them, it always expands out to other groups too, right? As we know that. And so Muslims in prison, imprisoned Muslims are one of those categories. And so that was a kind of spectacular case. But then I've been just looking at things in the last 20 years, and also this is kind of connected to projects too. Oh, sorry. You can hear me? Okay. I'm getting. I don't know this microphone. Okay. Where they're looking at access to the Quran. So sometimes a Muslim prisoner will want to read the Quran, but they get a tablet and they get charged by the minute that they're actually reading it. I mean, all these ways in which the Quran is being policed in U.S. prisons, and that prisoners' access to the Quran is always I mean, it's precarious. It's a kind of precarity. And so that idea of, for me, looking at 20 years of talking about good Muslim, bad Muslim, one of the things, as much as Mamdani's framework is so helpful, what we lose is what you're just getting at, which is that, before, there was a time when Black Muslims were seen as the cult, the dangerous Islam, and the Muslim world was seen as a sort of benign global Islam. And then it switches, right? Where Black Muslims are invisibilized, just to go back to, Suad Abdul-Kabir's work as well. And, the immigrant Muslim or the brown Muslim man becomes the figure, the stand-in for the dangerous Muslim world. And maybe if I ever get through this book and finish it, I would love to turn to a project on the racial history of cults. And so the Nation of Islam is very much on my mind. I'm always, thinking about that and, and taking it right up to this present moment where we're talking about this that idea, the racial specter of bad religion is just a thread through everything I work on, I think.
Fascinating. Well, you should definitely read this new biography. I think it's
yes.
And just one other question, and then I'll turn it back to Professor Ali, but something else that's come up. You mentioned tolerance as a discourse of power. That was sort of one of the titles on there. And you talked a little bit about that, but then kind of moved beyond it. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. I mean, these are obviously big debates.
Yeah, no. I mean, I will say that when I started the project, I thought the project was really about religious tolerance. And that was the entree to the culture wars. In other words, the culture wars are so much about intolerance. And I was really thinking that this book I was almost modeling the book on Wendy Brown's Regulating Aversion, where it would be about these different discourses around tolerance, but with, that where Muslims figure centrally. And I was really intrigued by that kind of twin, this sort of twin set of debates that are so different, right? So we're talking about Muslims in Iraq, it's about how do we make them tolerant, but then when we talk about Muslims in, in New York or anywhere, in Connecticut, wherever in the U.S., it's about, well, how much can we tolerate them? It's just that, so in other words, tolerance is working really differently when we talk about global debates and debates within the U.S. And I have to say that over the years of working on this, and I've kind of been chipping away at it for many, many years now, tolerance is no longer, it started to go into the background a little bit. So I think it'll still be part of the project, but I no longer think it's the driving question, which is where I started. And that's where I'm starting to go into this other material, which is trying to think through affect. I'm trying to think about the stickiness of the Quran. So I'm going to affect theory and Sarah Ahmed and others who think, how does the Quran become sticky? What is it? What is the stickiness? And so that's where these ideas around excess and racialization have maybe taken me in a little bit of a different direction. And I have to say, I think very early on, probably the first time I presented the material, someone said to me, a colleague at Northwestern was like, "Are you sure that tolerance is the thing?" And I was like, "Oh no, it is." But sometimes it takes a while. So as much as I'm kicking myself for not finishing this book by now, sometimes you'll get a better idea if you're just like sitting on it longer, so that's where I am now.
Absolutely. Well, Moral Combat took me more than 10 years. So yes.
Okay. Well, that's a great book.
I don't wish that on you, but it can take a while. So I want Professor Ali to get the last question here. So can I turn it back over to you?
Sure, thank you. So to end, I wonder, you've talked a bit about sort of this idea, as you were just kind of mentioning earlier, of celebrities endorsing the Quran, or this idea of the Quran becoming a bestseller. And I wondered if, as we leave, if you couldn't maybe unpack for us the racist logic that underpins the idea that studying the Quran can be a way to understand acts of violence, because this is something I feel like we deal with in the academy all the time with among very bright and well-meaning students and sometimes maybe less well-meaning scholars, but who are really committed to gaining this kind of cultural literacy when they take classes on Islam and the Quran. And they're usually motivated by this desire to dismantle what they recognize as a bigoted view. And I wonder if you could maybe suggest a framing.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't mean to be overly harsh about it. I think that what I want to show people is, an American audience, writ large. What the idea is that, what do you think you know about the Quran and or Islam, and why do you think you know it? So the impulse to take a class hey, take a class. I teach classes on this stuff too. So I'm always open to people wanting to learn. That's awesome. Curiosity is great. But I just want to signal and sort of show us and shed light on the ways in which the forms of our curiosity, we're also being shaped by things that are bigger than just us. This didn't just occur to you and like millions of other people to be like, oh, 9/11 happened, I should read the Quran, as opposed to a history book, or something about the Cold War, for example, or like the history of even Afghanistan. That's what I really want to get at. And I can't tell you. I'm not sure how much of my own story will be in this book or not. Right now, I'm not really writing it. For the first book, it had some self-reflexive elements or memoir type elements in it. This book may or may not. But I can't tell you how many times I've been in a situation where I'm in, there's like a panel about Palestine or something. And then, a Zionist gets up in the audience afterwards angrily and says, well, I've read the Quran, and then goes on to say something really racist. So it's like, it is to me like that scene of, which of course reminds me of the Black friend, like people being like, well, I have a Black friend, and then they go and say something really racist, right? So that formula, formulation, of course, it can also be Madonna saying, I've read the Quran and they're very nice, they're very good. It has good ideas in it, right? It's benign. Don't be scared of it, right? That script, it's a racial script, and I want to show that, like, we don't just do these things spontaneously. You're not going to, or it's US, right? Like that idea that like to root Americans as part of the American story. Sorry, are you getting me? To root Americans in the American story, we're trying to look for like the oldest Quran, the first Quran. Well, you're not going to find that with other scriptures. Like, are you going to look for? To claim rights in this contemporary moment, do we have to prove that we were here, like when the settlers came? Do you know what I mean? It's like that's not how it should work. And so I want to chip away at all of that.
Well, this seems like a wonderful place to end. I just want to thank you, Professor Greywall, for your wonderful lecture. It's going to be a great book. Thanks to Professor Ali for your terrific questions and the Q&A. And thanks to all of you, our audience, who have come and stayed through. And please email us if you have any more questions for Professor Greywall. And look for her book.
Yes.
Not too long from now. So
absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much. This was great. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Tazeen, for the wonderful questions. This was fabulous. So you've really made my month. I've got lots to think about.
That's great. Okay. Thank you so much. Good night.